All right, there we go. Hello. Now you can hear me. How's everyone's PAX Unplugged going? See, this one's always more fun when it's like midway through the afternoon because like 10 a.m. on the Saturday, people aren't quite awake yet, so I always get the fun cheer. Sweet. Well, nice to meet you all. Thank you for coming. So fun to see such a big audience in here, so thank you for making my talk part of your PAX. This is, if you wandered in here by mistake or if you're excited to be here, whichever, this is Worldweaving, Tabletop, and Textile History, and I will get into some introductions. I'm Cass. I go by StarsOfCassiopeia online. I've been cosplaying and making and generally interested in the greater realm of history and fashion since 2007. That's longer than some folks at this con have been alive. Yeah, it's been a long time. I do everything from sewing to armor to props to wigs and all the stuff in between. That's all me up there. We can talk about making stuff, but we're going to talk about like the designing and history stuff first and how that works in the characters that you know and love and the characters maybe you're making yourself. So generally want to set some expectations. The teacher and me's coming out here. We welcome all skill levels in this panel. We're going to really focus on vocabulary, terminology, design thinking around like character design and the history of fashion. So if you've got stuff to like Google and research after this panel, then I'm happy. I obviously cannot cover the entirety of human history in an hour, and if I could, then nice. I really could honestly do an entire weekend's worth of content on this stuff, but we're gonna really focus on, again, like the theory of it all and things that you can go search for doing your own character design and creation. There's also a ton of nuance in fashion, culture, and history. And again, I cannot cover everything, so I'm gonna try to showcase a variety of historical and cultural events and styles to kind of give you like a sprinkling of different flavors. I also like to call it too, like, be respectful if you're using these things in your games, in your own character designs, choosing your characters and design elements. There are some things in certain traditions that are meant for the people of those traditions. There are many other cases where people of those traditions and cultures are extremely happy to share. So like, do a little bit of homework and suss that out for yourself. I'm gonna save the questions to the end because we've got a lot to cover. I will also hang around outside after the panel. If there's stuff you want to ask me like one-on-one or about like one of your specific characters, please tell me about your D&D characters. Everybody's excited for that one. Some parts of this talk also require audience interaction, so we'll just do like hands up, shout out, I'll point at people. It's gonna be a good fun time. And I also like this too. Some people like to take notes during panels. Please, by all means, feel free to do that. But these slides will also be downloadable at the end. So yeah, okay. So I'll have a QR code up so you can get a copy of these slides. I usually leave them up for about 2 weeks after PAX because you'll get home, you'll be so exhausted, we're all gonna like pass out for 2 days, and then you'll be like, cool, I'm gonna make my next character. What the heck did Cass say on Saturday afternoon? So I will give you that as like my gift to you this PAX. Cool, fun freebie of slides, examples, history you can go back and reference later. You're welcome. So topic today, textiles and world building. We're gonna do very like dictionary definitions for a minute here so we're all on the same page as I like go through the theory. So world building, the process of constructing an imaginary world of cohesive elements, whether you're a game master, a novelist, whatever it is, if you are making a story and you are constructing the setting that it takes place in, those times, that place, that history, the culture in that game, like that's what I'm calling world building here. Textiles in general too, materials made from fibers used for clothing, home goods, etc. There's like a whole culture around like rug weaving, for example, in certain parts of the world. I'm mostly gonna focus on like the attire part of it for like you LARPers and cosplayers and for like you character designers because that's tends to be more applicable to like the game side of thing. Not to say it's not a super interesting world to go into, but clothing tends to be a little more applicable to like the game design stuff that we're gonna talk about here at PAX. So like, why does any of this matter? Clothing sets the tone of your character and ties them to their culture or country or region of the world. Think about like the last book you read, right? Usually like, you may not even get the character's name at first, but you generally start off with a description of what they look like before you know much else about them, right? Like you might get like how tall they are, what color hair or eyes, and then the next thing you get is their clothes. And that's really the first piece of information you have when you're introduced to a character, whether it's a visual of them or like just written out in text. You can get some clues based on like the clothing they're wearing, the shape it's in, like what is going on. Are they covered in blood? Are they like dressed in very fancy clothing, attending an event? That can give you a lot of context about not only who they are, but the setting and situation that they're in without like actually even having to say who they are directly. I hope you like puns. Everything is interwoven. Character design, world. There you go. You got it. character design, world design, and plot design all need to mesh together and play nice, because I'm sure you've seen pieces of media before where the character feels like they don't quite fit in right, or you've been in a world and you're like, oh, well, like, we just dropped someone from the modern day and it's weird. Or maybe you'd use that to create interest. Whatever way you're doing it, those pieces need to intentionally play together nicely, and I'm gonna help you do that, at least on like the character and world design side. So here's our outline for today. We're in the intro, that's this, right now. Terminology, words mean things. We kind of just got through that part too. We're gonna talk about some identifiable characteristics and how you design a character around key features. We're also gonna do kind of like a time, place, and vibe, some like general, quick, like common eras you see in history and culture. We'll talk about regions of the world, again, some of those run through history and like significant events in human culture that really influence like fashion and style, and therefore how it plays into character design. I'll touch a little bit on, surprise, I'm a cosplayer. So I'll spend a couple minutes there for you cosplayers and LARPers out there, whether it's your, you know, I'm on my like 80th costume at this point, or you're like first. We'll talk a little bit about how to translate those designs into things you can actually wear. If you want to talk more about that, probably grab me outside, because again, most of this panel is on like theory and history and not like construction. And then I will give you a list of some of my favorite references, like the books, the sites, et cetera, that I go to first when I'm doing research, so that you can have them too for when you're setting up your own characters in games. So clothing versus fashion, start there. Clothing, the physical garments you're wearing on your body, and fashion is the trends in style. So fashion describes the stylistic changes in clothing over time. Fashion, I also want to say, is not just clothing. It's also hair and makeup and accessories and shoes. You can look at like a big curly hairstyle and kind of a slightly older photo and be like, oh yeah, like that's the 80s. Yeah. So, and like, you know, whether you're doing like, you know, very, very bold makeup, or you're wearing particular like styles, like the big, you know, big poofy wigs is very like 1800s, for example. Some of the examples I've got up here, the like very thick eyeliner like feels very Egyptian. Those sorts of things also matter here. I won't talk as much about that, but like those pieces are also important and could be cool things to explore in your characters too. I also want to throw in history versus culture. So history of fashion is specifically development, purpose, intention behind those clothing, shoes, accessories, and culture is reflecting the beliefs, customs, morals, and values of a group of people. So history, for the purposes of my talk, right, time dependent. Like you can pick a specific point in time, whether it's like a particular day, a particular year, a particular decade, versus culture is not necessarily time dependent. These get a little wibbly wobbly because they are timey-wimey and interlinked. As I hear you Doctor Who fans out there. Culture is not necessarily time dependent, history is. So those are kind of our two different pieces, and those two things also do mesh together. But let's back up from even the history sec. Let's talk about like making characters that are identifiable in general. Who's that Pokemon? There's always one Pikachu. We were doing so well. But yeah, so like most of you got Bulbasaur. And if you don't know who Bulbasaur is, he's our little dinosaur dude there in the middle with a bulb on his back. You know, bulb and soar. Big brain Pokemon team. So what makes, this is where we're getting this audience interaction thing, so like put your hands up and I'll call on you. What makes Bulbasaur Bulbasaur? Yes. The bulb on the back, cool, yes. Yeah, he's got a very iconic shape. Somebody in one of my panels called him very friend shape, and I was like, well, you're not wrong. Yes.
Color palette?
Color palette, yeah, so like those like kind of tealy greensy. I saw a hand somewhere over, more hands? Yes. The patterning, yeah, it's kind of like these like little splotchy bits. Cool, yeah, I also have heard in the past when I've run this too, the big red eyes are very like iconic of Bulbasaur. Also his little pointy ear dude. There's not a lot to go on there. Like he's kind of a fairly simple design, but you can kind of see how, for example, my sketch translated and then my outfit translated for when I decided that I wanted to cosplay Bulbasaur. So I did like, you know, fleece little pajama onesies because the con was cold. Made the bulb on the back. It was a very comfortable pillow for sitting around and playing games, like real good. We have the big red eyes. I got my little pointy ears on top. My whole suit, I think honestly what took the longest was just sewing on those little patches to get like the right colors, the right shapes. Bulbasaur's not that complicated, but I put something that is very dinosaur-like and much cuter than I am onto my human body by maintaining those particular elements that you guys all just listed out. But you can make a bajillion different kinds of Bulbasaurs, and I've got the designers of each one of those sketches on here. So, you could do like a very like street fashion, J fashion kind of thing with the pleated skirt. You could do something like very formal, like the cowslip design there in the middle. There's a more masculine design on here from Yami, who's got like the pants and like the overshirt version instead. And then Yuri Kitten's example like has a full-on backpack for the bulb and does more of a skater dress. So I think if you saw any one of these, like somebody walking around PAX wearing any one of these, you'd be like, oh, that's Bulbasaur, cool. But these are very, very different Bulbasaurs, and the key thing that ties them together as Bulbasaur is those key character elements, the patterning, the coloration, those main features, that bulb, those eyes, those ear shapes, that makes it identifiable. This is a long list that I'm not going to read off. This is mostly a reference slide, but I'll go through of like the list of questions to ask when you're thinking about a character. This is like the at-a-glance one, but I'll go through with pictures. So the first thing I generally think about is like if I'm designing a character from scratch, are there key physical representative features? Do they have racial traits? What's their particular general body build? Do they have any disabilities? I think, for example, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a great example of different characters who have physical disabilities and use bending to get around them, using the magic of the world. So whether it's like, the wheelchairs or the gliders, for example. D&D or a lot of our tabletop games tend to have non-human characters. We've kind of got like two different dogmen there in the upper corner. Take a wild guess which one's the barbarian and which one's the bard. Yeah, okay, and you all are laughing, right? Because it's very, very obvious, like the big, hefty, bulky one has the muscle because that's what you need to swing around a big axe. That sort of character build informs that piece of the story. They should be strong. Versus our bard in the back, right? Like, we got like a little bit of swagger going. We got like kind of a showy hairstyle. Like, he's freaking holding a lute. Like, yeah, there are different pieces of that character we can immediately know, like, like you're a musician, you're a bard. Like, that's probably your role in the story, in the party. I like throwing out too, things like wings, scales, horns are all stuff you could think about, particularly if you're going for like a non-human character. That's stuff you want to think about first. It's also going to influence how they wear particular clothes, right? If your character has big horns, hats get a little bit harder. Wings get a little bit harder because if you want to like do a backpack too. So those sorts of pieces will kind of also influence each other as you're designing a character out. I also like to pull in like the cultural pieces of the physical and representative features. So like we've got our two Pokemon trainers here. And this is probably another obvious one. Guess who's ice and guess who's water? Right, like ice and water are very close as elements as like Pokemon that you would play in the game, right? But like it makes sense for the person in like the ice gym to be wearing these like very warm, very cozy looking clothing, like lots of layers, versus Nessa, our water type gym leader, like looks like she's about ready to go swimming. And either way, like they're very similar in terms of like the element they're working with and the theming, but Nessa's gonna be on a beach and I think she's gonna have a real bad time if we put her up in the mountains. I also like using Genshin Impact as an example from this because they have a number of gods who all have similar like social standing, but the regions are very, very different. So the first three in this game, one of them is from like a Mondstadt's like a Germany sort of inspired, Germany-Holland mix sort of inspired country on the top where we get like the cute little beret, like very Western Europe, like our shoulder capes and very fluffy like sleeves and collars, like more of a corset top. Versus our deity in the middle, Zhongli, is from a like China-inspired region where you get some more of like the traditional like patterns, like the shape of the waistcoat. And then our deity on the bottom, Raiden, is from a place that's based off fantasy Japan. So her outfit's got a lot more like kimono and samurai type elements. Like the shoulder pad looks like more traditional like Japanese style armor. We have like the big obi sort of belt and like the crossing shirt top that is like very traditional of like what Japanese clothing looks like. So despite the fact that they're all from the same game too, the individual like inspirations for each one of their regions influences their outfit as like the leader of that section. Talking about elements too, if you've got two enemies, which one's fire and which one's ice? Yeah, I think you guys are catching on to the trend here, right? Like it's very obvious based on the color palettes, the shapes. If you've got things that are like snowflakes and blue, it tends to be like cold or water versus the, the reds and the oranges tend to be like warm or fire. I also like throwing out too the sketch there on top where you can kind of see like the numbers like 3 and 4. That's one of my D&D characters. Her name's Monica. Literally, the sketch is exactly the same. Like my friend did this commission. We were debating what color dress we want. The only thing that swapped on those two is one dress is yellow and one dress is red. And it's amazing how even like changing that one key color kind of changes the entire look of the character. So like feel free to play around with that kind of stuff as you're designing your own. Same thing's kind of true with, I see the hand, I'll get there in a sec. The uniforms on the bottom, right? Like the Star Trek uniforms are exactly identical. I mean, except for throwing like the doctor's coat on top, right? They all wear the same black pants and the exact same top. But you know you don't want to be the red shirt. Other than that, though, like the actual details of the construction are exactly the same, but you can look at the person and be like, ah, you're gonna die next. Just because they're in red, so color can speak a lot. Yes, I saw a question in the back. Oh, I ended up going with the red one. Yeah, we thought the yellow was a little bit too bright and vibrant, given, I can tell you more about her story later, but this isn't a panel of me talking about my D&D characters that much. Yeah, she was from like kind of a like hillside town where she and her dad were like kind of in hiding, but they did also live like in a very like colorful like village full of like flowers, and flowers are clearly a big motif because they're embroidered all over her jacket. So I want something that made the flowers pop a little bit more, but it was also a little more muted and understated for a girl who works on the farm and who would absolutely get that yellow wildly dirty every day versus like the red dust would be able to handle some more of the dirt. So like practical considerations. If you're in a game, right, another thing to think about is what class are you in the game? Do you need armor? If you're playing a paladin, for example, you can probably guess which of these three is the paladin, which of these three is like the magician, and which of these three is the DPS. So, you know, are they light, medium, or heavy armor? What kind of weapons do they carry? It tends to become pretty obvious based on the tropes that we usually see in game that like big pointy hat tends to mean witch or wizard, big floaty thing, probably also magic. Big sword means you don't want to be standing in front of that. Another thing to think about with class is the social standing flavor of class. Is your character rich? Are they poor? Are they in the middle? What's their occupation? What can they afford in terms of clothing? Also, too, what's their personality? Do they care about fashion? There are plenty of very rich people who don't know how to dress, and there are plenty of people who make some awesome thrift store finds or, you know, recycling and upcycling clothing, but the way that looks and manifests is different. So if we go back to like medieval times, using an actual historical example here, your peasants tended to be dressed in much simpler clothing. They tended to be things that they can make out of like large single sheets, few seams. They tended to be more neutral colors because you could only get dyes from like the plants you were growing in your own garden. So you get like a lot of like muted colors, more like oranges, yellows, greens, and browns. They tend to be much more simply constructed. They also should hide dirt because if you're working in the field, you don't have time to wash stuff every single day, and it needs to hold up and be hardy enough for you to move and do your job. Meanwhile, if you're sitting up on your throne, you don't care how uncomfortable it is as long as you look good. Things like weaving and patterns in clothing, for example, like the sort of like squiggly eye pattern you see on the woman's dress there, that's expensive. Getting fabric made, especially custom woven for unique patterns, particularly in a time before a lot of automation, meant you had a lot of money. Doing a lot of different colors too, I'll talk more about like dye colors as we get into like the history section as well, tends to be the thing that like you can only afford it if you have to import plants or animals from other places to get those really bold, vibrant colors. You need more dye to make things brighter and bolder, and that's super, super expensive a process. So those are things that you see. You also get like the jewelry, right? Like you're not gonna wear a crown to go dig up potatoes. And I mean, if you are, like, more power to you, but like, does that make sense for that character? Probably less so. Anybody here an Adventure Zone fan? Yeah. I love using the Adventure Zone as a great example. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is a D&D podcast, so fun one to check out. Three brothers and their dad do a number of different arcs and styles. The one I'm referencing right now is the first arc called Balance, which is like your very traditional fantasy D&D. And I like using the Adventure Zone for this panel because it is, or rather was when it came out, an audio-only medium. They had no official art of the characters. They only had, for this character, 4 sentences. They described what she looked like in 4 sentences, and I made a cosplay off of it. So we're gonna talk about the exact quote from the podcast where I like scrubbed through line by line, pulled these pieces out from like the single paragraph from the DM, designed an outfit around it. And then we'll see how the comic version of it came out, which was kind of cool because they had those same 4 lines. So this woman, her name's Lucretia. They describe her as a middle-aged and largely exasperated human woman. Dark skin, white hair, voice dripping with gravitas, very ornate blue robes, a white oak staff, pure silver bracers with the Bureau of Balance rune on it. So that like sideways hourglass thing you see up there is like the rune they're talking about, and they do describe that at a different point. That's it. That's literally all they gave us, and I was like, I love this character, and I needed to be here, so I gotta figure this out. So we're gonna do a little like old school highlighting here, but on the board, because that's much easier. So director, Lucretia. The fact that she is called director already tells us a fair bit. That's our like class and social standing. So our color code here, light blue for those representative features, those physical and cultural. Yellow is those pattern print coloration motifs. Class in the game, because this is a D&D game, I highlighted in red. And then class, like her social standing, I highlighted in green. So director, we get some influence about her class. We know she's a person of importance. Middle-aged human woman, physical. So I'm like, cool, I don't have to paint myself green. Nice. We don't have a ton to go on in terms of cultural because we're pretty early in the game. We don't know a ton about like the place she's from. Like the player characters basically show up at her door and they're like, whoops, we blew up a city. So she's got dark skin, white hair. So we got a little more physical stuff there, but you know, fairly straightforward. Dark skin, white hair. Voice dripping with gravitas is super interesting because it gives the implication that she embraces her importance as this director position. Like if she could be, you know, lackadaisical and kicking her feet back, but have this title. But if she is like up here commanding, being very, very direct with the player characters, that means she probably takes her job pretty seriously. And that may reflect in how she dresses as well. We also know she's got a very ornate, so highly detailed type of design. Blue, we got the color, which is great. I was like, thank God I have something to work with. We know that her clothing is blue. She's wearing robes, and she has a white oak staff. The fact that we know there are robes, and she's got some sort of like magician staff because they're playing D&D, I'm like, okay, we don't know exactly what class she is, but like wizard, sorcerer, some kind of spellcaster probably makes the most sense. We've also got silver bracers, so I know that like there's some silver armor pieces, and then the Bureau of Balance rune is a motif that I know I should put in this outfit. That's actually kind of a lot to go on, given the fact that it's only 4 sentences. And here's how it came out. I made that costume in January of 2018, I think it was, and the comic came out 6 months later. So off of the same 4 lines, you know, the official artists who got hired to talk to the player characters and create the character came up with something kind of similar to what I had off of 4 sentences. So you guys can too. We're gonna play a game. We're gonna talk about, you guys are gonna design my D&D character. So his name is Val, but we call his code name in the guild, ooh, fancy, is Valor. He's a charismatic young crime lord who impersonates nobles and loves, subtly, showing off. The info I will give you to work off of. Race and class, he is a half-elf Way of Shadow monk in D&D. He does not want to look like this, though. Physical for his non-clothing appearance, dark hair, gray eyes, wiry build. Class, he's a crime lord with a lot of money, but he needs to be convincingly noble, even though he's not actually noble. The setting we were playing in, the DM told me, his home city pays pretty strong homage to Renaissance Venice, Renaissance Italy, and some other key things that were coming up in the story that the DM and I talked about were masks, that's the symbol of his crime guild. Dark versus light was a big theme in the story and the plot we knew we were going into. I had decided that he was an insomniac who stayed up late reading and writing, and then the diamond shape was also important for his particular guild and position as well. So, what's this man look like, guys? Yes? Eye bags. Eye bags, yes. Very patterned clothing, but cut in a way he can move. Yes, in the back.
Slash sleeves.
Slash sleeves, cool. Yes, behind you.
I kind of imagine like diamond-shaped like earrings because like that shows like he has enough affluence like for jewelry, but also is like its own notch to his skill.
Yeah, so diamond-shaped earrings, expensive to afford jewelry, works that shape in there. Yes?
Larger shoulder pads sort of reminiscent of like Romeo and Juliet were set in Berlin.
Yeah, so like the big, larger shoulders reminiscent of Romeo and Juliet. I'm just repeating to make sure that like the rest of the audience can hear. Yes? Glitzy embroidery. Oh, my favorite. Yes? Silk, yes, in the back. Okay, silk as well, great. Yes? Some kind of fancy cane, so like some kind of like really ornate weapon. Yes, in the front.
Off-white and like eggplant purples.
Off-white and eggplant purples. Yeah, yes.
Like dark red velvet, almost like purple.
Yeah. So we're thinking like reds and purples is like the one, and kind of like whitey goldies for the other. Yeah.
Long hair.
Long hair.
Short boots or shoes instead of long boots like work boots.
Yeah. Boots that this man can move in. Yes. Here.
A lot of rings for someone who uses wrist like
Ooh, yeah, rings as punchy things. We like that. Yes. Yes, so something fun going on up top. Yes. Yeah, so we do have that as the masks. Yes, so more of the masks worked into the outfit. Yes. So like some layer over top. It's like a coat. Multiple layers of opulence. Cool. Yes. Yeah. So like the classic like remove the stick sort of theater mask. Yes. Fancy buttons. Oh, I have a lot of feelings about fancy buttons. Let's jump back to this side in the back. Sorry, one more time. Scarves. Oh, scars. Yes. Interesting. Yes.
Along that same line, minor scuffs and tears in his clothes that he didn't notice.
Ooh, minor scuffs and tears in the clothes that he didn't notice. Interesting.
Subtle diamond motif in the clothing, like you're trying to hide it, but it's there if you look.
So like more subtle patterns. Cool. Yes.
Maybe some sort of weapon he could have at his side, like a fancy one that's not actually useful.
Oh, it's like ornate decorative weapon like hanging on the belt. Cool. Yes. We said overcoat. We got cloak now too. Yeah, same vibe I think. Yes.
I was going to say some kind of cloak cape, but with on the underside, both you and his back.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah. So like in a contrast lining, particularly something masky. Yeah. Oh, we like pockets. Yes. Fancy gloves hiding like supported wrists, like wrapped up for big punchy boy. Yes. Ooh, money pouch, big belt buckle, fancy. I've got a bunch here, so let's do both too. Yeah, ink stains generally, particularly on the hands from all the writing and reading. Yes. Glasses on a gold chain so we can read. Yes. Yeah, so something flowy that looks decorative but then ends up being functional in battle. A couple in the middle, yes. Yeah, so definitely like a little bit of makeup to like add to like the elegance and ambiance. Yes. He's got to have a hat. Cool. I think I've gotten through. Oh, we got a couple more hands. Yeah, I'll take 1, 2, 3, and then we'll call it because you guys are crushing this. Cuffed knee-high boots. Small crystal or glass. Sorry, one more time. Oh, vest with internal bowing, so a very structured garment. You guys want to see the results? Oh, I'm realizing that came up. All right. Y'all did pretty well. Yeah, so we got those glasses on a chain. I do have a diamond earring for whoever said this over there. It's actually the D8. Yeah. I always throw, if I'm cosplaying a D&D character, I throw the dice in there somehow. So the other ones, you can see them hanging off of the cloak, which got mentioned as well. We talked about a contrast lining too. So I had a 2-tone gold on the outside and a purple on the inside. So there's our light shadow. You guys got the colors right as well. We do have the bigger sleeves. We do have like the more structured sort of pattern. That technique is called smocking. We've got like our little bits of like jeweled elegance and opulence there from like the beading there. There's buttons that I'll show on the next slide. There's a ton of hand embroidery in those pants that are tailored in a way that are very easy to move in. We do have those knee-high cuffed boots that are very easy to like run and do like the work in. There are some rings on my fingers for being a punchy boy. We got the glasses. I do have, you know how fun it is to paint in your eye bags and not have to worry about it at a con? As a cosplayer, I'm usually like, oh God, I need more concealer. And this one, I'm like, haha, perfect. But yeah, no, you guys crushed it. We got like our elf ears, our glasses, our dark hair, patterns and prints. We do have those I realized I wrote on the slide none specifically in mine, and that's a big lie. Because you have the diamonds there on the sleeves and the diamonds there on the buttons. We have our dice, make it very obvious as a D&D character when you get up close. Lots of diamonds and jewels. There are 700 rhinestones on this outfit that I individually applied. Wow. Don't ask me how many hours that took. Yes. We got our purple, blacks, and golds, those like different colors that you guys picked out as well. Purple also implies wealth with snail dye, which is one of my favorite stories from the history section. We'll get there. And the class, like criminal but rich, the Venetian aristocracy. We have our silk. I spent so much money on real silk. It was worth it. I would do it again. I need you two to not let me do it again. I'm gonna do it again. But like, here's the sketch that came from that and some of the inspiration bits. So I've got kind of my like bits of fabric scraps there at the top, like the actual bits of silk that I went and ordered yardage of. The 2 images below are actually, this one was kind of a wild one that I think usually surprises people. I like to go on like Google Street View and drop myself in the city that I'm gonna be in, just like walk around. So those are the like flowery looking one that became the pattern on my sleeves it's like a garage grate in the city of Venice. And the other one that became the shape that I use for the buttons is the ceiling of a church in Venice. So like weird places to take inspiration from, but I'm like, look, it's right there. Like I'm straight up Italy. Thanks, Google. The other 4 below are more of the historical fashion pieces that I grabbed. So I liked justifying my choices there, like doing the gold piping on the purple was like, oh, sweet. Like there's like this like red burgundy looking dark color with these very, very ostentatious gold trims. I can do that because now there's historical context. I've got these like big black sleeves with the smocking style. I'm like, cool, now that makes sense to put in historical context for me as well. Doing this like 2-tone, very different, vibrant one, that pink and blue one. You see my like half cavalier cape. I'm like, great, that silhouette makes total sense, even if I don't want to look like I'm cotton candy today. And then we get the boots there on the bottom, like the cuffed ones for like someone who is a soldier, as a warrior, because this particular person dressed up has both this side cape and a sword. And I'm like, this is someone who actually does battle. It would make sense for my character to also have those shoes. And that became the doodle sketch you see there on the right. Couple more bits of those details, since you guys like really nailed a lot of those. Like I did have actual masquerade masks on my belt. One of them I did drag back from Venice. I worked on this for years. The rings that we were talking about that came up too, and like working in the guild symbol of the mask we did as well. I designed and metal 3D printed that particular ring, so it actually is like a mask, and the jewel in it is the open eye of the mask, so like, ooh, symbolism. The other one too, like the fancy ornate weapon that we had on the belt as well. People like kind of usually think it's a knife. I ended up going with a folding fan, because no one's gonna take your folding fan, but it can be very sharp. And so that became like a cool weapon, so I mounted my D20 on that particular one as like, you know, the weapon that I would play with in the game fairly often. That one was also a boomerang, which was very fun for me. But I think you guys have gotten the idea by like designing my D&D characters. These are the sorts of things you can do when designing your own. If you really want to get into it, here are my deep dive questions. 1, what materials did my character have access to? Things like spandex didn't exist until like the mid-1900s, for example. And like we can all cheat historical accuracy for our own comfort. I fully encourage that. But if you're like going real hard about it, there are only so many options. Certain colors also didn't exist in clothing. Like a lot of the neons, for example, are much more modern inventions of dye technology. So again, like things that were natural dyes are much more likely to be things that you'd find in eras of days gone by. Thinking about how that garment would have been made, what production methods. Like we know in history, and I'll go through this when we get to the timeline, like when we discovered the ability to weave, when we actually invented the sewing machine, doing certain things by hand is extremely tedious, and therefore garments didn't really involve those sorts of techniques until we could do it much more automated. What's the purpose of this garment? If your characters are showing up at a wedding in the first session that you're playing, that attire is going to look very, very different if they just ended a bar fight and are now in jail. I mean, maybe if you can figure out how to make both of those work, then you're onto something. But like, the attire they're probably going to show up for a drinking night out with their buddies is not going to be the same as like, you know, their best friend's like biggest day. And the other thing to think about too is like what you can do your character afford. So again, going back to like those classes, that involves like a lot more research about like what the nobles were wearing versus what the common people were wearing, and versus like what the, say like the middle or merchant class is wearing. But those are ways to like really get your hands in there if you want to like go ham and go hard on your character design. So let's get into the history of it now that we talked about like the fantastical imagination parts. Time, place, and vibe. Thinking about what year, and I say year in quotes, of the society that your game, your story takes place in. Fantasy's obviously not one-to-one with reality, but you can choose clothing that matches the vibe. I figure a lot of folks in here are familiar with steampunk. This is very like Victorian era, Industrial Revolution. The actual time periods for those are 1760 to 1840, and then the Victorian era has like a slight overlap in the UK where it's 1837 to 1901. So you've got like 150 years in there, and fashion can change a fair bit. But there are some trends that do like change and evolve over those 150 years that make sense. You see a lot of corsets. You see a lot of like World War I style military, or not World War I's a little bit late. You see a lot of like much more of those like military type jackets. You see a lot of like bustles and hoop skirt sorts of things. You see a lot of metallic, which is more of the steam part of the steampunk. But that's how you can start with a silhouette and like add those details to make sense. On the flip side, for example, the future could be really anything in terms of fashion, but we tend to have like a much more like sleek tech wear sort of look to it. So if I take like cyberpunk edge runners, for example, or like cyberpunk 2077, they give us a year, but that year's 50 years away from the year that we are in right now. And if you've got a time machine, come talk to me afterward, because I'd love to know. But a lot of these are influenced by 2010s and 2020 streetwear. So if you go on to like New York Fashion Week, for example, and look up like what the streetwear brands are putting out, you'll see a lot of these like funky cut like bodysuits and like weird baggy pants that like little top, big pants kind of thing, or like the very oversized like sort of shinier jackets over like tight fitting tank tops is like a thing in the streetwear fashion world of today that people are clearly riffing on for these like future techno looking aesthetics. When you're thinking about your game, think about these analogous places and times. Are there places in the real world that you're taking these little bits of inspiration from? Similar real world environment means you can start your like historical research part there. In terms of historical fashion, this really starts in human history when we get societies, when we get societal structures that let people not just worry about like their own food, shelter, clothing. It's when they can start like spending time and getting good at sewing, at drafting, at construction. And that's when people can spend their entire weeks and days doing real design versus clothing being designed solely for the experience of, I need to not freeze this winter. So this timeline's a good one to reference later in terms of like the downloadable slides if you just need a quick glance into like starting from the Stone Age all the way through to like 1960 and get like a quick look at like, okay, where vaguely do I need to be in the ballpark for my own designs? Some popular eras of inspiration, places to start that you might have seen in your games, your media, et cetera. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, pretty classic. I think everyone's probably familiar with like the toga and what those drapes look like. There are a number of different sub-styles of togas, for example, and those are cool and interesting if you're doing something that's got like a Greek pantheon type vibe to it. If you want to go with like a more of a South American flair, that's the traditional Aztec wear that you see there in the middle with like the very bright, bold red woven pieces and the face paint as well. Ancient Egypt is pretty common as inspiration for a lot of games that you'll see. I think folks are probably familiar with that one. The one there, that's the black and white one in the bottom left, is ancient Persia, which if you've played anything that's based off of like 1001 Arabian Nights or like Aladdin-y sort of in vibe, that's the time period you want to be looking at for those silhouettes, which is surprisingly cool and often doesn't get the love it really deserves. In the middle there, I've got like some clothing from the Indian subcontinent from a similar time period, and then we've got like the Hanfu from ancient China. When we get into post-colonialism, we tend to start getting like things that are very Eurocentric because Europe is like, haha, I want to own the world, and therefore you guys are going to all dress like us. You tend to see those fashions start to bleed out in like the 18 and 1900s. So we've got our Elizabethan up there on the top, our big fluffy neck ruffles. We've got like a lot of jewels, particularly from the nobles, because each one of the European powers was trying to be like, I'm the coolest and best, and I wear the shiniest stuff. We get things that are a little bit less fluffy, but still very structured there in the middle with the Victorian era. We've got our Revolutionary War coats that are very iconic there. Down on the left, we're in Philly. Want to throw in some American history. The Zulu tribe are the folks who have like the cool shields and spears there on the bottom. Those were about 1500 or so in South Africa, which is pretty cool. And they have a ton of awesome traditions around like using beads to indicate your status in the society, and like the sorts of colors you were able to wear with your uniform like was a big thing. And these were a very powerful group that was fighting back against a lot of the Europeans who'd started to come through. We've got our big cupcake-looking Rococo period there with the skirt you definitely can't get through the door with. If you think that if you couldn't walk up and down stairs with it, it's probably Rococo. I also like throwing in a couple of examples from East Asia from this time period because, again, very Eurocentric, but you're starting to see this bleed into more of like the traditional Asian styles as well. So we've got the early 1900s up there in Japan where they're keeping a lot of like the hakama pants with the traditional pleats, and they keep the kimono collars that cross, but you're starting to see like Western hats being worn with that, or like loafers that come from Europe made out of leather as opposed to like more of the wooden shoes that we typically tend to see with Japanese fashion. And you start to see that sort of bleeding in that time period. We also had, this is like the 1940s, which is the qipao from China, and this was a whole movement of women who wanted to dress a little less conservatively and show that they like had a place in society, and they wanted to rebel against the status quo. So they started wearing cuts that were very, very different, much shorter. The Mandarin collar tended to shift it over. They were showing a lot more of their arms. So fashion sort of changing around like these sorts of social movements too. If we're getting a little more modern here, once you get kind of into like the 1900s or so, the US tends to be a much bigger player too in the fashion world, and then it becomes global as globalization is more of a thing. So you've got like your 1920s like flapper attire up there, although that actually wasn't as common as you think. That was a very specific subset of people, but if you wear that, people are like, oh yeah, 1920s, so you can kind of get away with it. Anybody in the 2000s will recognize the Cheetah Girls? Yeah, all right, yeah, my childhood for sure. I don't know why we did that. Skirts over jeans was a choice. Yeah, if you want to look like you're from the early 2000s, just put on more layers, and then put on a couple more, and then maybe you're good. I like throwing the 50s, 60s, and 70s there on the bottom because you've got like your 50s housewives that are very prim and proper, like the more form-fitting tops with the collars that button down the front, typically patterned cottons with like a very flowy skirts. In the 60s, we get more of these interesting neckties with it, and the skirts become a little bit less full, but we're still keeping those fun pops of like bright colors and patterns. And then we get to the 70s, and we are just full-on disco at that point. That's some like historical fashion, so I also want to throw in the cultural fashion piece of it, so more by like the groups and traditions of people. If you think of the kilt, you probably think of Scotland, yeah? Yeah. Interestingly, the Scottish didn't actually pick up kilts until like the mid-1850s when they were like, why don't we have a cool thing to wear? Let's make it plaid. These are comfy. Like, yeah, like no joke. Basically just like, oh, like one family was kind of just like, yeah, I want to hang out and like wear my cool family colors on something that's visible. And the kilts were interesting too because they're made of, I think it's like generally about 30 pleats for each of them. So they take yards and yards of fabric. But because of the way they're constructed, you can pass them down to your children without it's very easy to adjust the size because you just change the spacing of the pleats. So the kilts became like a hand-me-down and like an identifier of your clan. And they were like, oh, this is cool actually because we're all fighting each other. I'd like to not stab my buddy. In Japan, we've had the kimono for forever. That's probably a fairly standard one. You've also got like the more casual version of that called the yukata, made out of cotton. The kimono typically tends to be silk. But like a very classic, you've got like the right over left version of the collar folding over. You got like the big bulky waistband part. The women typically tended to dress to be a little bit more square because they were trying to be like more modest. This was like a very common thing in the more formal Japanese attire. So they'd like pad out their waist and try to not have like particularly pronounced chest for that. I've also put like up the Indian wedding sari as well. So these tend to be like the more elaborate ones, and they typically tend to be red and gold because those colors are considered lucky or fortuitous for a marriage that is upcoming. But you'll get a lot of like very long draped fabric. Even now, India has some just gorgeous fabrics if you want something that's like very brightly colored or patterned or really well embellished. Like I love getting trims from Indian companies for that reasons if I'm doing something particularly like fancy or ostentatious or noble because they just, it's so sparkly, guys. It's so fun. If you're going down to Central South America, the Jalisco dress in Mexico is pretty cool. Yeah, I heard cheer. If you've ever seen the women who like grab their skirts and dance and do like the massive twirls, these dresses were designed for that because there's so much yardage in them that you can actually grab and twirl without like really showing anything, but it makes it a much more dramatic. If you tried to grab a mini skirt and do that, that's not really gonna work. And then throwing in a Polynesian example, in Hawaii, the Pau Pau Ma'olo, which I always do my best to pronounce, and if you know better than I do, please come correct me. It typically tend to be like your traditional hula attire, so you've got like a looser fitting top, the palm frond skirt that sways with you as you do like you do your motions, the leis as well, and the flowers in the hair is like a very common thing you'd see hula dancers wear in a lot of more of the island regions of the Pacific. We're going to talk about our fictional cultural fashion here, cultural in quotes. Your elves typically tend to be like very sleek, very polished, very woodsy, like things you would see people running around in a forest. Your mermaids tend to be using these ocean elements, right? Like you got a starfish in her hair, she's got pearls on her tail, like a seashell bra kind of thing. Our hobbits are generally creatures of leisure if we're going back to Lord of the Rings. They're wearing very comfortable fabrics that feel a little bit fancy, but they want something that they can, go party in. Our dwarves tend to have like the very long beards and the jewelry that ornaments it. They've got like these very rugged and structured sorts of metallics because they typically tend to be from mountainous areas. And then our little flower fairies tend to be like small, so they're working with materials that are organic. So it looks like her petals. She's got petals and leaves that make up her shirt and her skirt because those are the kind of things that make sense for creatures that are 6 inches tall. So there are two kinds of elves. And this is why, like, even the fictional cultural fashion matters, right? Like, both of these elves exist in, our general knowledge of the fantasy world, right? Like, you've got your Tolkien elves and you've got your Christmas elves. And if you don't specify and you walk into a game and you're like, we're killing Santa Claus, you're like, oh, I made a very wrong elf for this. This is a cool example of both that I love to give is the Chinese Hanfu. There's a group in China called the Han Chinese, which is their traditional clothing style. It started in about 4000 BC with it started in the year 4000 with the Yellow Emperor, whose wife was like, I want something cool that's like just ours. So she designed this, and then because it was the Empress, everyone's like, I also want to dress like the Empress, and it became kind of like the known clothing of this group. But it looks very different in each dynasty. So you start up there with like the year 618 there on the left, and then by the time you get to the bottom, you're in like 1644. So 1,000 years of history, you can see stuff changes a lot, like where exactly the ties are change, how high the neckline is change, what the layers over the top look like, but you still kind of have these long flowing skirts. You still have these like jackety sort of layers. You still have some kind of like tie that holds it together. There are elements that carry through these 1,000 years, and the materials tended to be the same, typically silk, because that was a material whose harvesting technique was invented in China. But the exact shape and pattern and color went through trends over this 1,000-year period as well. So we've got a cultural fashion that does evolve over time. Going into like commonalities of the world by region, so we're gonna do some little map jumping here. Clothing production is really dictated by climate. So the climate and biome of the place you're in determines the flora and fauna of that region. And the flora and fauna are the things that you as people living on a continent in a country have to make your textiles and dyes. So if we start in ancient Egypt, right, like we typically see our Egyptians wearing these flowy white clothing and like these like spun woven sandals, right? Pretty common attire if you've seen like anything set vaguely in Egypt at all. This white flowing fabric is because the style was like very loose. It provided sun coverage in a very hot climate, and it kept the wearers cool because it kept the air trapped closer to their body and let like them be able to move and catch the breeze when it did come through. That white is from the flax plant, which is, surprise, surprise, grows in various, very large quantities by the Nile River. So unsurprisingly, cities and civilizations in Egypt that popped up by the Nile River had a lot of that plant to work with, and that's like, okay, cool, what can we make out of it? And that's the fabric they began to weave. The papyrus plant, which also grows in that same region, is a little bit stiffer, so it wasn't as comfortable to wear as like clothing, but they realized that if they wove it or twist it, they could make small ropes out of it, they could weave it into like harder sheets, and that became the shoes that you typically see in ancient Egypt. So that's the process you see at the bottom. The papyrus plant going into the weaving with the wet strips, and then when it dries out, it becomes like a nice hard sole that you can walk on hot desert sand with. Totally other side, if you want to jump to somewhere cold, talking about like the Inuit parkas in the Canadian Arctic. They're wearing clothes that would not fly in Egypt. These are multiple bulky layers. They tend to be fur because it's really freaking cold that far north in Canada, and these are the natural fur colors of animals. In climates like this that are very rocky, very cold, there's not a lot of like sun or nutrients for plants to grow, and therefore it's a lot harder to figure out what you want to do with dye. So they just kind of left the colors of the original animals there. You can kind of see like the whites of the furs and the browns. In terms of the animal hides that they had, it typically tended to be caribou and seal. They're really good for the warm and insulating outer layers. Kind of nasty one, but super clever. They would take the internal guts of a lot of these sea mammals because they were waterproof, and they'd use them to like sew up their backpacks to keep their own stuff dry, which is a very clever use of the materials they had around them. So the animals that lived in these aquatic climates, they would take and say like, okay, like we know this thing will keep moisture out. I need to stay dry. I will make my shoes, my bags out of this. A third one, jumping down to Africa, this is the dye production, indigo dyeing in Nigeria. So you can see how vibrant a blue this is. That's the indigo plant there on the left, and what these dye baths look like. So they would dig out pits in the mud and then fill it with water, fill it with the indigo dye, basically let the sun essentially boil the color out of the plant, remove the plant itself, and then do some really sick tie-dye type designs that you see on that woman's attire there. Like both pieces that she's wearing are from the indigo dyeing techniques, which basically were tie-dye, but all just from the single dye bath of this plant. And she's got the blue also streaked all over her face for a particular festival and ceremony. So because this was a native plant to that area, and there was a lot of it, it was a commonly available dye, and therefore it became part of their traditional dress because it was easily accessible and something that everyone could really do. All you had to do was bunch up or tie the fabric together, dunk it in one of these pots, hang it up and let it dry, and you've got some really cool patterns that like pretty much anyone can make their own, but they're all that same blue color. Some examples of fantasy or fiction inspired by the aforementioned. If anybody's played the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, you've got everyone standing behind the pharaoh in those flowy white garments we're talking about. They tended to do white flats for these because it was easier for the animators to draw, but you could also put them in these same sandals. The water tribes in Avatar, whether it's The Last Airbender or Legend of Korra, have those same sort of silhouettes that you were seeing from the Inuit in Canada. They've got these like furry line things. They typically, for the show, they obviously make like the outfits blue because they're like, oh, this is the water people. But you could just dye the same material you got like from those furry animals, those caribou, the seals that the actual people were using to make those outfits. And then Afro Samurai, which takes a lot from the sub-Saharan African culture, has this like weird blue tinge to it for a lot of the characters from that part, referencing the indigo dye in Nigeria. Some highlights on the history of clothing overall. Fashion does, as we've seen, not exist in a vacuum. It's inherently linked to politics, economics, science, and more. So we're going to get into some of those things too, since I've kind of done the like timeline view and also the like map view. History of clothing in terms of economics, we really kick this off in like 114 BCE when the Silk Road trade starts, and we start getting Europe and Asia just giving stuff back and forth, which could be a really cool opportunity in like one of your games or for your characters to do like the first cross-cultural integration or the first cross-cultural encounters, and maybe have that be a plot point for you. And we don't really get like really widespread trade until as late as 1800 after that, when we get like the widespread railway construction. People are moving stuff just a heck of a lot faster. We start getting a lot more like far Eastern Asia and Europe talking to each other in 1858 when the Harris Treaty opens up Japan. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, you guys have been chilling here on an island for a couple hundred years and you make some cool stuff. Now we can have it. And now you can have our cool stuff. And that's when those cultures sort of start to blend. Particularly useful if you're doing something like anime inspired, for example. And then we get big globalization in the 1900s and everybody's just talking and trading to everybody. In terms of production, if we're talking about, remember those deep dive questions I mentioned, like what materials were accessible? We get silk as early as 4000 BCE in ancient China. We get cotton about 1,000 years later in Mesopotamia, so they're kind of like in the Middle East region. We get 550 BCE is the first evidence of upright looms, so people are just kind of like making it up as they go. We don't get these large swaths of fabric until then. And it's not until 1800 that we actually get like the sewing machine. So people were just doing everything by hand up until that point. And the 1800s is really when fashion could take off a lot faster and things start changing a lot faster because you can just make clothes faster. You also have a ton of interesting social movements here. For workers' rights, in 1833, the UK Factory Act was like the first incident of child labor laws being enacted in the world because children were being used to make clothing, and the government's like, maybe we shouldn't do that. In 1911, in New York, not far from here, there was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which is the thing that started basically all safety regulations in factories and workplaces. Like OSHA came out of this incident where a number of people died because they couldn't get out and the cotton that they were working with caught fire, and fabric's extremely flammable. In terms of women's empowerment, in the 1830s and 40s, we have the Lowell Mills girls. This is the first instance of a lot of women being able to strike out on their own in New England because they had their own source of income and could stand on their own 2 feet. In 1919, we get the May 4th movement in China, where like the Qi Pao I was talking about starts coming into play, where women started deciding like what they wanted to wear themselves and creating kind of a new subset of dress because it's something that like they wanted to use to express themselves in response to a very strict and oppressive government. The 2017, the Time magazine cover I showed with the pink hats might be familiar to some of you, like the pussy hats. So when people were marching for women's rights in DC, a lot of women were getting around with pink yarn, trading each other, knitting those particular hats, both to keep them warm and reference like women's rights that they wanted to in that particular moment. And it was even just like 2022, so 2 years ago, there was a UN white paper about folks who were addressing sexual violence through economic opportunity. And there was a case study of a clothing company that was teaching women how to sew and create garments that they could, stand on their own 2 feet and rebuild their lives, which is pretty cool. In terms of history of clothing and science, we get the first sewing machine patent in 1790. We get the cotton gin a couple years later, so fabric production, again, really taken off around the 1800s. We don't get a lot of these like fancier like sportswear type fabrics until the 1940s or so. People were trying to innovate for World War II, so DuPont Textiles was doing a lot, and we got things like Kevlar, for example, out of that. Spandex, rayon, nylon came shortly after in the next 2 or 3 decades. I mentioned purple before, and this is one of my favorite ones in the science. This guy named Perkin Mauve messed up so bad trying to cure malaria, he invented purple. Yeah, so he was like, he was so bad at science, and he just like messed up his experiments again, and he was washing out his beaker with alcohol, and it turned purple, and he went, huh. And then he decided to do it again, and he's like, oh, I can replicate this. And then he made a lot of money and retired early, and good for him. But that's why like mauve is a shade of purple. It's this dude's last name because he invented the dye that became that purple. And before this, you had to boil a bunch of snails, which is why only the nobles could afford like the rich shade of purple before, because that was really expensive. But then we got Perkins mauve, and then everyone could wear purple. And that's kind of cool if you like purple, so PAX Unplugged's favorite color. We don't get like embroidery machines until the 1960s, so it's really only like the last couple of decades. And then we honestly are still working on textile recycling as a world, as a society. Like we don't really know what to do with clothes when they go to the trash these days. So when people get good at recycling, we're gonna see a huge rebirth of people using upcycled materials and making new blends, and that's gonna wildly change fashion when we as a culture get good at it. Yeah, plastic yarn has started to become a thing too. I also know that I've got like 3 minutes, so I'm gonna get through the last of the slides, and then we can do Q&A outside. The 1940s were kind of cool because like the jumpsuits that you see there for the women were designed because they wanted something fashionable but cute that they could hang out in the bomb shelters for. And the shape of a lot of modern purses is because that piece on the bottom was wide enough to fit your gas mask. Yikes. Yeah, I know. But hey, more space for your stuff in your bag. So I guess. Uniforms and symbology, like you'll see if you look at like US military history over time, for example, the pattern changes depending on where you were. If like you're in the 1950s and you're fighting the Vietnam War, you're in the jungle, so it's a lot more greens versus like the evolution of camo for like a lot more of the Middle Eastern type of wars. And then there was an entire 100-year war in North America between the French and the Iroquois over who got to make the cool beaver hats. That was a long time just to have a fluffy little tail on your head. Cosplay and LARP stuff. Go back to those deep dive questions I've mentioned. For some non-human features, you can do things like horns, you can wear gloves, face paint will get you pretty far. You can get prosthetics or ears to do things that are like fawns or elves. You can also even make like your own wings out of these linkages that I've shown. And I know Jenny D, who's also here around the con, made like a very cool tutorial on how to make a centaur set of legs. So you can do a ton of non-human stuff too. If you don't know what Homestuck is, you don't need to Google it, but the cosplayers are really helpful. You can build off of motifs. My Thorn Princess costume, for example, has a ton of roses worked into it on the crown and the imprint of the lining. Some of my D&D characters, again, there's that design we were talking about with the alternate colors. She's a character who regularly forgets her memory, so I've got the Forget-Me-Not flower worked into her outfit a bunch. My other character there that I've cosplayed, it's a deity of a tree type spirit, so I've done a ton of tree embroidery, and all the leaves are fall leaf colors. Cultural influences, here's like a Japanese example for the anime folks. Traditional kimono headpieces. I've got like the halo headpiece of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, for a character who's like a semi-deity. And then some traditional Japanese bead painting on the beads I actually used in the outfit. If you don't want to make this yourself, I also, shameless plug for Cosmosii, which is a commission-based website. You can pay other cool artists to make it for you and then just show up and look cool. So I like to call that one out. And references, YouTube's awesome. Costube in particular does like a bunch of seminars you can watch for history. Patterns of Fashion, one of the best set of books. They're a little expensive because they're out of print, but like they know what's up if you want, and the errors are right on the cover of the book. The Met and other museums, you can just like go Google their collections and look at photos online and then not get yelled at by security when you get your face too close to the glass. And the Smithsonian Definitive Guide to Fashion is always the first book I grab. It's like a literal textbook, and you can just go through, and there's like a page or two on pretty much every era on every part of the world if you're just trying to like, at a glance, say, like, I don't know where I need to be in any of this, and kind of like pinpoint down. We're at time, so start with your real-world inspirations. Change, add, and remix to suit your world. Characters build off your key characteristics that we talked about, like those things that make the character, and the details will fall into place based on their specific background. Things that seem simple and commonplace can have widespread effects in your character and your game, and most importantly, when you're designing, have fun. I let you guys go too long on the character design part. It was fun, though. So if you want to download the slides, the QR code on the left will take you to my link tree with all my social media and the deck. And then the one on the right is for the PAX feedback. So if you'd like this panel and want more like this or more from me in the future, tell them so we can come back. Thanks, guys.